I'm Becca, and this is Deadly Truths, Season 3, Morally Bankrupt. This season, we're stepping into the smoke and the spotlight of America's criminal underworld, the gangsters, grifters, and killers who turned sin into style. These are the stories of outlaws who mistook fame for freedom and the country that loved them for it. From John Dillinger to Bonnie and Clyde, from the conmen who sold redemption to the bank robbers who sold rebellion. We'll unravel how America built its most dangerous myth. The crime, if done with charm, can look like courage. Power, greed, glory, violence. Every name in this season had all four, and none of them ended clean. This is Deadly Truths, Morally Bankrupt, where we count the cost of fame bought with blood. Let's begin. America was broke, and not just in the wallet. It was 1933. Red lines stretched around the corners. Bank doors were locked behind iron gates. Ordinary people were losing farms, homes, hope. And then came a man who robbed the very banks that had foreclosed on them. He smiled for cameras, threw money into crowds, and made people feel, for a moment, that someone was fighting back. But this isn't a Robin Hood story. It's a story about how a wounded country turned a murderer into a folk hero, and how that same hunger for spectacle still lives inside us today. The making of a myth. John Herbert Dillinger was born in 1903 in Indianapolis, the son of a grocer who believed a firm hand could cure a restless soul. His mother died when he was just 4 years old. His father, stern and moralistic, ruled the house with a Bible in one hand and a belt in the other. He believed hard work and punishment could carve goodness into a boy, but what it really carved into John was resentment. Neighbors would later recall a boy who was bright, polite, even charming, but easily led astray. Teachers said he was restless. His father said he was wild. Either way, the world around him was small. Sunday sermons, long days of chores, and the slow rhythm of a Midwestern childhood that never quite fit the speed of his thoughts. He tried to be good. He joined the church choir, played baseball in dusty lots, and worked odd jobs for pocket change. He helped at the family store, swept the floors, stacked shelves, and listened to the older men tell stories about soldiers, guns, in the old days. But there was something in him that didn't want the slow life. Even as a teenager, he had that glint, the same one that would flash in every mugshot later on. A look that said, "You can't own me." By 17, that defiance found an outlet. He was stealing cars, racing them through the night just to see if he could. He wasn't after money, not yet. It was the rush, the sound of an engine, the brief illusion of freedom. But in a town that small, rebellion doesn't stay secret long. When he turned 20, he tried to start over. The Navy promised structure, respect, maybe redemption. He enlisted, hoping the uniform would make him a man his father could finally approve of. But the military didn't want free spirits. It wanted obedience. Within months, Dillinger went AWOL. They called it desertion. He called it survival. When he returned home, America was changing. The Great Depression hadn't hit yet, but the storm clouds were already gathering. Jobs were scarce, tempers short, and dreams smaller by the day. His father remarried and moved the family to Mooresville, Indiana. Then came Burrell. She was young, beautiful, and believed in him when no one else did. They married in 1924, and for a while, he tried to live like the rest. Steady work, small paychecks, Sunday dinners. But normal life itched at him like a wool suit in summer. He wanted more, not riches exactly. Control, power, the thrill of making the world bend to his will. And then came the robbery. A local grocery store, a small job. It was supposed to be easy, quick in, quick out. But there was a pistol, a witness, and a bad getaway. The law didn't see a foolish young man. They saw a criminal. The judge made an example of him. 10 to 20 years for a $50 stick-up. That was the real turning point. The day John Dillinger, the myth, was born. Because prison wasn't just punishment. It was a classroom. Behind bars, he met the professors of America's underworld, seasoned bank robbers, safecrackers, and escape artists who took him under their wing. They didn't see a lost boy. They saw potential. By the time he walked out of that prison, he wasn't the same man who went in. The system had done what it always does when it confuses reformation with confinement. It taught him to survive, to plan, to outthink, and to strike back. The boy from Indianapolis was gone. The outlaw had arrived. Let's talk about the school of crime. In 1924, prisons weren't reform schools. They were finishing academies for the desperate and the damned. A man might go in green, scared, or stupid, but he'd come out with a graduate degree in criminal enterprise. In Dillinger, he enrolled with enthusiasm. He was sent to the Indiana State Reformatory first, then transferred to Michigan City State Prison, a grim gray fortress with walls that looked like they were meant to keep hope out as much as prisoners in. The air inside was thick with sweat, iron, and resentment. Every clang of a cell door reminded him that his father's tough love and the judge's sermon about repentance had all led here, a place where men learned to stop apologizing. But Dillinger wasn't the kind to wither. If he couldn't escape physically, he'd escape mentally. Inside those walls, he met his professors, so to speak. They were older, sharper inmates who recognized potential in the kid with the sharp smile and the restless eyes. Among them were Harry Pierpont, Homer von Metter, Russell Clark, and Charles Mackley, men who had already earned reputations in the underworld for their precision and nerve. They took Dillinger in not as an equal, but as an apprentice. Pierpont especially became a mentor, meticulous, intelligent, and ruthless. He taught Dillinger that crime wasn't chaos, it was logistics. Every successful job started with a plan: casing the bank, learning the schedules, studying escape routes, bribing the right guards. Mackley showed him how to handle a gun, not just shoot it, but own the moment. Van Metter taught him how to move through a crowd without being seen, how to make people underestimate you. Dillinger soaked it all up. He read obsessively military manuals, detective novels, books on psychology and mechanics. He drew maps, memorized blueprints, and he rehearsed imaginary getaways in his cell like other men rehearsed prayers. The guards thought he was restless. They didn't realize he was rehearsing his rebirth. But the real lesson he learned inside wasn't about guns or getaway cars. It was about power. For the first time, Dillinger understood what it meant to be the one giving orders instead of taking them. He saw how control over fear, over people, over the story was more valuable than any loot. The world had told him what to be, and prison taught him to stop listening. He once confided to a fellow inmate, "They made me what I am. They'll pay for it with interest." It wasn't bravado, it was prophecy. Outside the prison walls, America was unraveling. The stock market crashed in 1929. Banks were failing by the thousands, families were losing farms, and men were sleeping in bread lines instead of beds. The country that had locked him up for $50 was now robbing millions in daylight. By the time Dillinger walked out in May 1933, he was 29 years old, harder, sharper, and far more dangerous. He had spent nearly a decade being molded by men who viewed the law as an obstacle, not a rule. What walked out of those gates wasn't a reformed citizen, it was a man educated in the wrong subject, holding a grudge and a master plan. The Great Depression was about to meet its most charming outlaw, and for a few brief, furious years, John Dillinger would turn that education into legend. So now it's time to talk about the Gentleman Bandit. When Dillinger walked out of prison in 1933, he wasn't looking for redemption. He was looking for a paycheck. As I had mentioned, there were breadlines and boarded up factories and banks throwing families into the street. While ordinary men stood in soup lines, Dillinger and his crew were walking into those same banks with machine guns, taking back what America had stolen. At first, the papers didn't know what to make of him. He wasn't crude like the old school killers. He didn't curse or beat his hostages. He was polite, almost charming, a man who smiled as he emptied the vault. One witness recalled that he tipped his hat to a trembling bank clerk and said, "We don't want your money, folks. Just the banks." Another time, he handed a frightened farmer back his few dollars, saying, "Keep it. You'll need it more than they do." The press loved that kind of story. They called him the Gentleman Bandit, the Robin Hood of the Midwest, even public hero #1. And Dillinger didn't argue. He knew that myth was more powerful than truth. He wore tailored suits, slicked his hair, and smiled for the cameras. A criminal who understood publicity before Hollywood did. He laughed in mugshots. He winked at reporters. At a time when men were losing everything, he looked like a man who refused to be broken. His robberies were executed with military precision. His gang, the Pierpont crew, moved like clockwork, in and out in under 2 minutes, everyone knowing their role. They robbed banks across Indiana, Ohio, and Illinois, always one step ahead of the law. They used fast cars, inside connections, and even police uniforms. Some banks didn't realize they'd been robbed until Dillinger was halfway to another state. But he wasn't just stealing money, he was stealing headlines. In a country drowning in despair, he became a symbol. Reckless, defiant, alive. 2 working-class Americans who saw bankers as villains. Dillinger looked like poetic justice in a pinstripe suit. He represented freedom, the fantasy that one man could still beat the system. To J. Edgar Hoover, however, Dillinger represented something else entirely: humiliation. The FBI, still called the Bureau of Investigation, was really young, bureaucratic, and eager to prove itself. Hoover had built his agency on the idea of discipline and respectability. His men wore press suits and carried law books as often as guns, but to the public they looked like amateurs chasing ghosts. Every time Dillinger slipped away, every jailbreak, every gunfight survived, the papers mocked the Bureau as college boys with badges. Hoover took it personally. He saw Dillinger not as a criminal, but as a challenge to his authority, a taunt broadcast on every front page in America. He began reshaping his bureau into something harder, deadlier, and far more political. Machine guns replaced legal pads. The war on crime was born not from justice, but from embarrassment. And Dillinger, without meaning to, had lit the fuse. He wasn't just robbing banks, he was robbing the Bureau of its credibility. He was robbing Hoover of control. And J. Edgar Hoover was not a man who tolerated being made a fool of. What started as a string of clever heists was turning into a national manhunt, one that would end in blood. It's now time to talk about the myth machine. Dillinger's story didn't just make headlines. It fed them. It was gasoline on the fire of a nation desperate for distraction. In the early 1930s, America was collapsing under the weight of its own despair. Banks had failed, homes were vanishing, and men who'd worked all their lives now were begging for food, their pride evaporating with every empty bowl. What they needed wasn't another sermon about hard work. They needed a fantasy. Enter Dillinger. The newspapers turned him into exactly what the public craved: a handsome outlaw thumbing his nose at the system that had broken them. They printed his picture like a movie poster: the slick hair, the sly grin, the confident eyes of a man who never bowed to anyone. He was the anti-banker, the Depression's dark folk hero, a man who took back from the institutions that took from everyone else. Hollywood joined in. Movie theaters ran double features about romantic gangsters and fast-talking rebels who shot their way to freedom. Warner Brothers screenwriters studied his exploits for inspiration. To the public, Dillinger wasn't a criminal, he was an idea. defiance dressed in a suit. But the truth behind the headlines was darker. His robberies were not victimless. Guards did die. Bank tellers developed tremors that lasted the rest of their lives. Innocent bystanders were caught in crossfire. He was not Robin Hood, and he didn't give anything back to the poor. He was a narcissist who believed his own myth, a man convinced that the rules did not apply to him. Dillinger saw himself as the lead in a movie that no one else had agreed to star in. He liked being watched. He craved it. When he escaped from the supposedly escape-proof Crown Point jail using a carved wooden pistol blackened with shoe polish, the nation gasped. The newspaper called it Dillinger's magic gun. Photographers captured him grinning like a vaudeville performer as he strutted past guards who had just been made fools of. That smirk, that blend of arrogance and delight, was his signature, and America couldn't look away. Every time he humiliated the law enforcement, ticket sales at movie theaters spiked. Radio hosts speculated about his whereabouts like sportscasters calling a game. Songs were written in his name. He became the embodiment of a dangerous illusion that rebellion and righteousness were the same thing. People didn't just follow his crimes, they rooted for him. They mistook his charm for courage, his cruelty for confidence. In an age of hopelessness, he looked like control, and control, even in the hands of a killer, was something the public longed to believe in. So they cheered him on. They made him a myth. And once America starts building a myth, it never stops. Not until there's a body to bury. And this leads us to the women and the illusion of loyalty. Dillinger's story would be incomplete and perhaps less seductive without the women who orbited his chaos. They softened his image, humanized the monster, and in the end paid for his myth with their lives and reputations. To the public, they were romantic figures, moles, lovers, accomplices, but in truth, they were the mirrors that reflected who Dillinger really was, a man who mistook charm for love and loyalty for possession. There was Mary Evelyn Billy, the quiet young woman he met in Chicago's dance hall in 1933. She was half Native American, half French, with dark eyes and a shy smile that disarmed even him. She had worked as a waitress, a nurse's aide, the kind of jobs that kept her close to people but far from safety. When she met Dillinger, she saw not the fugitive, but the man beneath the headlines. Witty, wounded, magnetic. He promised her adventure, maybe even love. She followed him from town to town, tending to his wounds, sewing his clothes, and cleaning his guns. When he was shot in St. Paul, she stitched him up by lamplight, whispering prayers over a man who didn't believe in anything except escape. She hid him in safe houses, drove getaway cars, and faced federal raids with quiet terror. To the outside world, she was his partner in crime. Inside that illusion, she was a woman trying to save a man who didn't want saving. When she was finally captured in 1934, porters swarmed her like she was a celebrity. They asked if she regretted it. She smiled sadly and said, "I'd do it all again." But her letters from prison tell a different story, one written in ink and loneliness. They reveal a woman grieving not just for Dillinger, but for the person she'd become while loving him. She believed she was protecting the man she loved. In reality, she was protecting the image he loved more than her. And Billy wasn't the first or the last. Before her, there was his wife, one and only, Beryl. The girl next door he married before his first arrest. Sweet, steady, and heartbreakingly normal. She waited for him after his sentencing, writing letters full of forgiveness. He never wrote back. By the time he left prison, the marriage was a ghost he never bothered to bury. Later came Pat Charrington, a mole who helped him after his infamous wooden gun jailbreak. And Anna Sage, the Romanian madam, who would ultimately betray him to the FBI in exchange for a promise that was never kept. Each woman played her role in the film that was his life. The nurse, the wife, the accomplice, the traitor. and he drifted through their devotion like a man walking through mirrors, admiring his own reflection. Dillinger treated affection the way he treated banks. Take what you need, move fast, and leave before sunrise. He didn't believe in permanence, not in love, not in friendship, not in life. Every connection was transactional, another getaway car waiting by the door, and yet people still called him charming. The women who loved him gave the story its heart, that they also exposed its hollow core. He could be tender in moments, almost gentle, but only when it served the story he was telling about himself. He needed to be adored, not understood. He wanted loyalty, not because he valued it, but because it made him feel untouchable. In the end, the women didn't just humanize John Dillinger, they revealed him. For all his swagger, he was a man terrified of intimacy, addicted to control, and incapable of loving anything he could not escape from. And that pattern of taking, fleeing, and leaving wreckage behind tells you everything you need to know about who he really was. It leaves us with public enemy number one. By the summer of 1934, Dillinger had become too famous to live. His name was linked in every newspaper, his grin splashed across every front page, his legend retold in every diner and pool hall in America. He was not just a criminal anymore. He was a cultural phenomenon, and that made him dangerous in more ways than one. Hoover saw an opportunity. His Bureau of Investigation was young, underfunded, and desperate for legitimacy. The nation was reeling from bank failures, kidnappings, and a public growing cynical about law enforcement. Hoover needed a villain, a face for America's fear, and Dillinger, with his charm, his gun, and his myth, fit that role perfectly. On June 22nd, 1934, Dillinger's first birthday, Hoover gave him a gift wrapped in political ambition, the title Public Enemy Number One. That label wasn't just a warning, it was marketing. It was a brand. It gave Congress a reason to fund Hoover's agents and gave the newspapers a story they could sell. America now had a folk devil to balance its folk hero, and Hoover would be the man who caught him. The country, weary from the Depression, was hungry for moral clarity. They wanted to believe that crime had a face and that justice could be restored if that face was destroyed. Dillinger became the scapegoat, a symbol of chaos, arrogance, and everything Hoover swore to end. And Dillinger played his part perfectly. He couldn't resist the spotlight. Even as the noose tightened, he fed the legend, smirking in photographs, taunting the law, posing for cameras in stolen police uniforms. He dyed his hair, had his fingerprints burned off with acid, and even underwent crude plastic surgery to alter his face. Yeah, I'm not lying, guys. This stuff is real. But no scalpel could erase the swagger. He still walked like a man who believed he was untouchable. He hid in Chicago with a small circle of allies and a new girlfriend, Polly Hamilton, a waitress who thought he was a traveling salesman named Jimmy Lawrence. The woman who would betray him, Anna Sage, was also there, a Romanian madam facing deportation looking for a way out. When the FBI came knocking, she offered Dillinger on a platter. The deal was simple. Help them catch public enemy number one, and she might stay in America. On the evening of July 22nd, 1934, Dillinger, Polly, and Anna went to the Biograph Theater on Lincoln Avenue to see Manhattan Melodrama, a gangster film starring Clark Gable, a man not unlike Dillinger himself, suave, confident, doomed. It was the perfect irony. On screen, the outlaw dies in a blaze of glory. Outside, the real one was about to do the same. Anna wore an orange skirt that glowed red under the theater lights, the famous Lady in Red, though in truth it was never red at all. As the movie ended and the crowd poured into the humid Chicago night, Anna touched her scarf, the silent signal. FBI agents, led by Melvin Purvis, were waiting. Dillinger stepped into the street, smiling unaware. When he realized the trap, he bolted towards the alley. Witnesses later said he reached for his pistol. Others said he never had the chance. I hate to say it, but I kind of believe the latter. Either way, the night erupted in gunfire. Bullets tore through the humid air into the man who had outrun nearly everyone. He stumbled, collapsed against a brick wall, and fell face down into the dust. The crowd screamed. Cameras flashed. It was over. Body of public enemy number one lay sprawled in a Chicago alley. The blood of America's favorite outlaw mixing with the gutter water of Lincoln Avenue. Women dipped their handkerchiefs in his blood as souvenirs. Nasty, right? Reporters pushed forward to confirm the kill. They were lying in wait. Hoover sent a telegram to Washington. Dillinger dead. Justice done. But justice and closure are never the same thing because the story didn't end there. It never does when myth and mortality collide. The man was dead, but the legend, the one America had helped build, was just getting started. Rumors spread immediately. Some swore the body was not his. Others claimed the FBI had shot the wrong man. Conspiracy gave way to nostalgia, and nostalgia gave birth to a new industry, the immortalization of John Dillinger. He had gone from outlaw to icon, from man to myth, and in the end, that's what he always wanted. Not freedom, not redemption, but immortality in the eyes of a country that could not decide whether to damn him or miss him. And now we have the circus of death. Within minutes, the gunfire outside the Biograph Theater, the legend of Dillinger began its grotesque afterlife. The alley where he fell became a shrine, a crime scene, and a carnival all at once. There was women in summer dresses that knelt beside his body, and as I mentioned, they were dipping their handkerchiefs and scraps of fabric into the blood that was pooling on the pavement, as though collecting relics from a modern saint. Men tore pieces from the police barricades as souvenirs. Children stared wide-eyed as flashbulbs exploded, freezing the outlaw's final pose, face down, hand half curled, life leaking into the gutter. The newspapers sold out before dawn. Dillinger dead, screamed the headlines, as if the country had been holding its breath for this moment. Extra editions hit the streets every hour, and radio announcers described the scene like sports commentators calling a championship game. America had turned a killing into a broadcast event. By morning, the morgue was a madhouse. Thousands of people lined up outside Chicago's Cook County Hospital, shuffling forward in the July heat just for a glimpse of his dead body. And if you haven't seen the photos of this, it's so macabre and disturbing. It's super weird. Reporters elbowed one another for position. Mothers lifted children onto their shoulders to see over the crowd, to look at the face that had haunted the headlines for years. And again, a dead body, okay? Some cried. Others laughed. Everyone wanted proof. Inside, attendants struggled to keep order. The air was thick with sweat and ink and the strange electric thrill of proximity to fame and a dead body. Photographers climbed onto tables for better angles. Flashbulbs burst against stark white walls as Dillinger's body lay stretched on a slab, a tag tied to his toe. His famous smirk was gone, replaced by something small and human, the expression of a man who finally ran out of time. It was supposed to be the end of the story, but it felt more like the premiere of a new one. Reporters described it as if they were in a theater. Crowds pressed against the glass viewing window, whispering as though they were watching the curtain fall on a play they didn't want to end. The morgue had become a sideshow. It was a grotesque exhibition of national obsession. What should have been a private reckoning turned into public entertainment. In the reflection of those glass panes, you could see America staring at itself and liking the new view. It was macabre, but also revealing. The same country that condemned violence now treated it like spectacle. Death had become a commodity. Morality, a performance. Dillinger was gone, but the hunger he fed remained, that deep American craving to turn sin into spectacle, to worship rebellion right up until the moment it dies. He had lived as an outlaw and died as a headline, and in death he gave the country what it secretly wanted all along, the thrill of watching a sinner fall and the comfort of knowing someone else had to pay the price for all the darkness. The curtain closed on John Dillinger, but the show, America's endless fascination with outlaws, had only just begun, because now we've got the FBI in the aftermath. J. Edgar Hoover wasted no time turning Dillinger's death into a national event, and more importantly, a personal victory. Within hours of the shooting, the telegram from Washington, they were flying. Press statements were drafted, and photographs of the slain outlaw were distributed nationwide. Hoover had seized the moment with the precision of a man who understood that power is never earned, it's taken, and often from the dead. He declared it the Bureau's first great triumph, a victory for order over chaos. In the days that followed, Hoover was front and center in every newspaper, his agents praised as heroes. He called Dillinger's death a decisive blow against the forces of crime, a phrase that sounded rehearsed because it was, a line crafted for Congress and the cameras. That single event changed everything. It wasn't just the death of a criminal. It was the birth of an empire. Hoover used the spectacle to justify sweeping reforms, larger budgets, new field offices, and expanded jurisdiction. The Bureau of Investigation soon rebranded as the Federal Bureau of Investigation, the FBI as we know it today. Its agents were suddenly national icons, clean-cut, sharp-suited, and incorruptible. The war on crime had a face, a uniform, and a myth of its own. The propaganda machine roared to life. Posters, newsreels, and radio broadcasts painted Hoover's men as moral crusaders, the last line of defense against the dark glamour of men like Dillinger. The irony, of course, was that without Dillinger, the Bureau might never have found its purpose or its public. Hoover owed his legend to the very man he destroyed. Hollywood followed close behind. Within months, studios were racing to capitalize on the story. Pulp magazines and low-budget films turned Dillinger into a tragic anti-hero, part rogue, part romantic. Actors with perfect smiles and slick hair reimagined his robberies as adventures, his violence as style. The real man, with all his blood and fear and broken lives, disappeared beneath the fiction. By the time the decade ended, Dillinger had become shorthand for rebellion, a symbol of charm and danger, rebellion and control. His story had been scrubbed clean of terror and painted in the colors of nostalgia. To the public, he was no longer the man who shot guards and terrified tellers. He was a fantasy of freedom who stood tall when the world was on its knees. Meanwhile, the real people left in his wake were fading into silence. The families of the dead bank guards, shot police officers, and innocent bystanders, they had no parades, no headlines, no Hollywood portrayals. Their grief did not sell papers. No one lined up to dip a handkerchief in their sorrow. Their stories were buried beneath the noise, quieter, truer, and far less cinematic. In the end, Dillinger's legacy wasn't just crime, it was transformation. His death became the seed from which the modern FBI and America's obsession with outlaws grew. He turned Hoover into a national power broker and turned himself into a myth. And in that exchange, one man's life for a government's authority, America revealed what it truly valued. Not justice, but the story of justice. What is the psychology of a spectacle? What made John Dillinger so irresistible? Why did a man who robbed banks and left bodies behind become a symbol of charm, freedom, and defiance? Part of it was timing. He appeared in the cracks of the Great Depression, when millions of Americans were powerless, evicted from homes, stripped of dignity, crushed by a system that favored the rich. Dillinger walked into that despair like a spark in dry grass. He wasn't just an outlaw, he was a projection, the fantasy of control at a time when control was impossible. Part of it was presentation. Dillinger understood performance long before mass media understood itself. He knew how to turn violence into theater. The tailored suits, the grin in every mugshot, the casual confidence of a man who refused to cower. Even I have to admit, when I look at his mugshots, I can't help but think that the man looks sly and he definitely looks attractive. He turned the bank robbery into quick, clean, and almost cinematic. When he escaped jail with a wooden gun, it wasn't just an escape, it was an act. He wanted to be watched. The merger of crime and celebrity, morality and attention. But the largest part was us. America wanted to believe in him. We wanted someone to break the rules when we could not. We wanted a man to stand up to the bankers, the judges, the polished system that had failed us. We wanted to look at the wreckage and call it rebellion, to see violence and mistake it for freedom. It's an uncomfortable truth. Every myth needs an audience, and Dillinger's audience wasn't just the desperate, it was the decent too. Ordinary people who turned him into a symbol so that they wouldn't have to look too closely at what he actually did. He became a moral mirror, reflecting what people wanted to see. Power without consequence, defiance without guilt. That's what makes this story morally bankrupt, because the real tragedy isn't that John Dillinger died young, is that we learned all the wrong lessons from him. We elevated a narcissist into a full hero, mistaking his charm for courage and his chaos for freedom. We turned murder into myth, crime into character study, and justice into entertainment. In the end, Dillinger didn't corrupt America. America revealed itself through him. Its fascination with power, its worship of rebellion, its addiction to spectacle. And if you look closely enough, you'll see that the story never really ended. It just changed names. Every generation finds its own Dillinger. Someone to hate, someone to worship, someone to watch fall. Because in the end, it's not the outlaw we're obsessed with. It's the reflection of ourselves staring back from his story, daring, defiant, and just a little bit in love with the chaos. I can't stress enough, Dillinger was never a Robin Hood. He did not steal for the poor, and he didn't fight for justice. He stole because he could, because it thrilled him, because it gave him the illusion of power in a world that had once made him powerless. The guns, the cars, the headlines, they weren't rebellion. They were vanity. He was not a hero of the people. He was a mirror of our own fantasies. We saw what we wanted to see in him. In the middle of the Great Depression, when life felt small and cruel and hopeless, Dillinger became a projection screen for the collective American dream of defiance. And still to this day, if you don't know all the gritty details, he still looks like that. We wanted him to punish the institution that had failed us, the bankers, the judges, the faceless system that took everything but accountability. But instead, he showed us something darker. How easily we can mistake chaos for courage, charm for character, spectacle for substance. Every crowd that cheered his capture, every flashbulb that lit up his corpse, every newspaper that turned his death into a souvenir, all of it proved what Dillinger already knew. In America, fame always outruns morality. It did in 1934. And it still does. That's why his story still matters, because the obsession did not die with him. It simply evolved. The stage changed from bank lobbies to news cycles, from getaway cars to viral clips, from front page headlines to trending feeds. The same psychology persists. We turn criminals into celebrities, cruelty into courage, and tragedy into content. Dillinger's story is not just about one man, it's about the American machine that creates men like him and then consumes them. The hunger for excitement, the blurring of morality and spectacle, the public's endless appetite for rebellion packaged as entertainment. It all started long before social media and true crime podcasts. It started here with a boy from Indianapolis who learned how to make sin look cinematic. When we glorify cruelty because it looks brave, we repeat the same sin. We turn death into theater and justice into a photo op. And somewhere beneath all that noise, the real victims, the guards, the tellers, the families, disappear into silence. Maybe Dillinger understood that better than anyone. Maybe he saw it coming. The cameras, the headlines, the worship. Maybe that's why he kept smiling even when the world was burning behind him. He once said, "I rob banks because that's where the money is." But maybe the truth is simpler and sadder. Maybe he robbed them because that's where the applause was. And maybe that applause never really stopped. And that's the story of John Dillinger, the man who taught America how to love its own outlaws. He did not just rob banks, he robbed the line between fame and infamy. And we're still paying the price because every time we turn violence into a legend, every time we dress ego up as courage, we write another chapter in the same old story. I'm Becca, and this has been Deadly Truths. This season is Morally Bankrupt. If you found this story compelling, follow Deadly Truths on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. Anywhere you listen, I'm probably on it. Please do rate, share, and leave a review. It helps keep these forgotten histories alive and me telling the stories. Next time, we're going to discuss, and this one is a classic, two young lovers with nothing to lose and a trunk full of bad ideas. Episode 2 is going to be The Lovers and the Lie, Bonnie and Clyde, because there is a lot to unpack there. As always, thank you for listening and thanks for your time.